Welcome to This Explainer. I'm so glad you're joining us today because we're going to unpack a massive historical myth and uncover a reality that is deeply complex, absolutely fascinating, and just incredibly impactful. We're looking at Christopher Columbus and the true story of two completely different worlds colliding.
So think about this for a second. What if the man who became one of the most famous, globally recognized explorers in human history wasn't actually looking for America at all?
And what if, when he set sail across the vast Atlantic Ocean back in 1492, he firmly believed he was heading somewhere completely different? It's kind of staggering when you think about it. The dramatic irony is wild. He was steering toward a landmass that would literally change the world forever, but he had absolutely no idea where he was actually heading.
And finally, what if the journey that made him a celebrated hero in some parts of the world became the beginning of an absolute catastrophe for millions of others? It really forces us to ask, who was the real Christopher Columbus? Okay, let's dive into this.
Section 1. The Myth and the Mistake.
For centuries, Columbus has been celebrated as the guy who supposedly discovered America. But when you look at his early life in Genoa, his intense obsession with the sea, and the ideas he was developing, well, that traditional narrative starts to look fundamentally flawed. The land he reached was already inhabited. People had been living there for thousands of years before his ships ever appeared on the horizon. They had their own established nations, vibrant cultures, and incredibly deep histories. Columbus, meanwhile, never actually figured out where he had landed.
And this brilliantly illustrates why this journey even happened in the first place. Columbus had what was considered a highly dangerous idea: to reach Asia by sailing west. Now, people back then already knew the Earth was round, right? That wasn't a new concept. But Columbus made an enormous mathematical error. He massively underestimated the overall size of the Earth and the distance between Europe and Asia. It was just a colossal geographic miscalculation.
Because of that bad math, for years, no one wanted to take a risk on him. He was famously rejected by Portugal because his plan just seemed way too dangerous and, frankly, way too expensive. But he wouldn't give up. Finally, in early 1492, he gets his big break. He secures funding from Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And let's be clear, he wasn't just exploring for the thrill of it. He was after wealth, trade routes, fame, and power, and the Spanish monarchs promised him impressive titles. So in August of 1492, he finally set sail, eventually reaching the Caribbean on October 12th.
Section 2. Into an Ocean of Fear.
90. I really want that number to sink in for a moment. 90 is the approximate number of men who were aboard his three ships, the Santa Maria, the Niña, and the Pinta. It perfectly highlights how incredibly small the initial spark of this massive global change actually was. Just 90 guys, watching the coastline of Europe disappear behind them, sailing into the complete unknown.
As days turned into weeks, the reality of that enormous miscalculation Columbus made really started to set in. They were sailing into waters they barely understood, across an ocean far, far larger than anyone expected, with the winds pushing them further and further from home. The crew was experiencing severe anxiety and mounting terror. There was zero guarantee they'd ever make it back. Historical accounts even suggest Columbus kept two separate sets of distance calculations. He kept a shorter one to show his crew to keep them calm, and a longer one that reflected what he actually believed they had traveled, all just to maintain their confidence. When they finally spotted land, Columbus was so convinced they were near Asia that he called the locals Indios.
Section 3. The Tragic Transformation.
Now, what's really interesting here is the stark, truly tragic contrast between these two worlds colliding. On one side, you have the Taíno people, the first indigenous communities he encountered. These were complex societies with political leaders and deep spiritual traditions. But on the other side, you have Columbus's colonial mindset. He didn't look at them and see peers. He saw possibility. He looked around and saw potential sources of gold, forced labor, and people to be converted to Christianity. He essentially saw people to be controlled. So, Columbus eventually makes it back to Spain alive. He brings with him indigenous captives, unfamiliar plants, and these wild stories, and he's hailed as a celebrated hero. But his next expedition, which was much larger, had a completely different goal. This was no longer an exploratory mission. It was strictly about establishing a definitive claim for the powerful Spanish monarchy. It was straight-up colonization.
And the consequences of this colonization were undeniably catastrophic. The arrival of Europeans introduced deadly diseases like smallpox to populations that had absolutely no built-in immunity to them. But disease wasn't the only devastating factor. There is extreme violence, incredibly harsh treatment, and forced labor in mines and agriculture, mostly because the Spanish were completely obsessed with extracting gold. This combination led to mass displacement, widespread hunger, and the ultimate destruction of indigenous social structures. Entire communities, unique languages, and generations of knowledge simply disappeared.
Section 4. The Columbian Exchange. Let's zoom out for a second and see how this all builds, because it really forces us to rethink our whole definition of the word discovery. Did Columbus discover America? Well, if we mean he was the first human being there, the answer is a hard no. Indigenous peoples had been living there for millennia. And on top of that, archaeological evidence at Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland confirms that Norse explorers had already settled in North America around the year 1000. So he wasn't even the first outsider.
But his voyages are historically significant for another massive reason. They triggered a permanent connection between the Old World and the New. This was a massive global transfer of biology and economy that we now call the Columbian Exchange. From the Americas over to Europe went things like potatoes, maize, and new wealth, which completely transformed European diets and economies. And from Europe over to the Americas went new animals and crops, but also colonizers and those deadly diseases we mentioned. This massive exchange irreversibly reshaped ecosystems all over the entire planet.
Section 5. A complicated global legacy.
As for Columbus himself, his later life was marked by a pretty steep downfall. His colonial administration essentially failed amidst infighting among the colonists. He faced intense opposition, was formally accused of cruelty and gross mismanagement, and eventually the very man who had once returned as a hero was arrested and shipped back to Spain in absolute disgrace. And in a twist of profound historical irony, when he died in 1506, he still firmly believed that his voyages had brought him to the edges of Asia. He literally never understood the new world he had collided with.
So the crucial point here is that his legacy isn't some simple tale of heroism. We really can't just slap one label on him. Yes, he was a highly skilled navigator, and he was determined and ambitious enough to cross an ocean that most others were terrified of. But he was also a fundamental part of a system of conquest that brought about enormous suffering. He was the catalyst for a bridge that eventually carried soldiers, merchants, and entire empires across the water. It's a deeply complex story of ambition, monumental mistakes, power, discovery, and very severe consequences.
Which brings us to a final lingering question. Was Columbus responsible for everything that followed? Well, not entirely. The colonization of the Americas involved monarchs, thousands of other explorers, settlers, and massive economic systems operating over centuries. But his colossal geographic mistake was the spark. It was the opening chapter of a collision between two worlds separated for millennia. A massive transformation that birthed colonies, fueled empires, sparked revolutions, and eventually led to the United States of America. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and I